Hello there. Come in. Take the weight off. Welcome to Homemade Audiobooks, the coziest corner of YouTube, a nest where you can settle down, turn the lights low, shut your peepers, and listen in to my homemade narrations of some of my favourite ever tales. These will be slightly over-the-top readings, with silly voices, accents aplenty, and a whole myriad of sound effects, all intended to give you the most immersive experience possible. What's better than reading? Well, listening to someone read to you. If you're enjoying my creations, then head over to Patreon to support my efforts. It would mean ever so much. For now though, let's head off to 1960s New York and the Gothic splendour of the Branford Building. It's time for Ira Levin's legendary horror yarn, Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby, written by Ira Levin, read by Homemade Audiobooks. Part 1, Chapter 6. At a few minutes past 6:30, Rosemary and Guy left their apartment and walked through the branches of dark green hallway to the Castavet's door. As Guy rang the doorbell, the elevator behind them clanged open, and Mr. Dubin, or Mr. Duvall, they didn't know which was which, came out carrying a suit swathed in cleaner's plastic. He smiled and, unlocking the door of 7B next to them, said, "You're in the wrong place, aren't you?" Rosemary and Guy made friendly laughs, and he let himself in, calling, "Me," and allowing them a glimpse of a black sideboard and red and gold wallpaper. The Castavet's door opened, and Mrs. Castavet was there, powdered and rouged and smiling broadly in light green silk and a frilled pink apron. "Perfect timing," she said. "Come on in. Roman's making vodka blushes in the blender. My, I'm glad you could come, Guy. I'm fixing to tell people I knew you when. Had dinner right off that plate, he did. Guy Woodhouse in person. I'm not going to wash it when you're done. I'm going to leave it just as it is." Guy and Rosemary laughed and exchanged glances. "Your friend," his said, and hers said, "What can I do?" There was a large foyer in which a rectangular table was set for four, with an embroidered white cloth, plates that didn't all match, and bright ranks of ornate silver. To the left, the foyer opened on a living room, easily twice the size of Rosemary and Guy's, but otherwise much like it. It had one large bay window instead of two smaller ones, and a huge pink marble mantel sculptured with lavish scrollwork. The room was oddly furnished. At the fireplace end there was a settee and a lamp table and a few chairs, and at the opposite end an office-like clutter of file cabinets, bridge tables piled with newspapers, overfilled bookshelves, and a typewriter on a metal stand. Between the two ends of the room was a 20-foot field of brown wall-to-wall carpet, deep and new-looking, marked with the trail of a vacuum cleaner. In the centre of it, entirely alone, a small round table stood holding Life and Look and Scientific American. Mrs. Castavet showed them across the brown carpet and seated them on the settee, and as they sat, Mr. Castavet came in, holding in both hands a small tray on which 4 cocktail glasses ran over with clear pink liquid. Staring at the rims of the glasses, he shuffled forward across the carpet, looking as if with every step he would trip and fall disastrously. "I seem to have overfilled the glasses," he said. No, don't get up. Please, I generally pour these as precisely as a bartender, don't I, Minnie?" Mrs. Castavet said, "Just watch the carpet." "But this evening," Mr. Castavet continued, coming closer, "I made a little too much, and rather than leave the surplus in the blender, I'm afraid I thought there we are. Please sit down. Mrs. Woodhouse?" Rosemary took a glass, thanked him, and sat. Mrs. Castavet quickly put a paper cocktail napkin in her lap.
Mr. Woodhouse, a vodka blush. Have you ever tasted one?
No, Guy said, taking one and sitting.
Minnie,
Mr. Castavet said. It looks delicious, Rosemary said, smiling vividly as she wiped the base of her glass.
They're very popular in Australia,
Mr. Castavet said. He took the final glass and raised it to Rosemary and Guy.
To our guests, he said. Welcome to our home.
He drank and cocked his head critically, one eye partway closed, the tray at his side dripping on the carpet. Mrs. Castavet coughed in mid-swallow.
The carpet,
she choked, pointing. Mr. Castavet looked down.
Oh, dear,
he said, and held the tray up uncertainly. Mrs. Castavet thrust aside her drink, hurried to her knees and laid a paper napkin carefully over the wetness.
Brand new carpet, she said. Brand new carpet. This man is so clumsy.
The vodka blushes were tart and quite good. Do you come from Australia? Rosemary asked, when the carpet had been blotted, the tray safely kitchened, and the Castavets seated in straight-backed chairs.
Oh, no,
Mr. Castavet said.
I'm from right here in New York City. I've been there, though. I've been everywhere, literally.
He sipped vodka blush, sitting with his legs crossed and a hand on his knee. He was wearing black loafers with tassels, grey slacks, a white blouse and a blue and gold striped ascot.
Every continent, every country, he said, every major city, you name a place, and I've been there. Go ahead, name a place.
Guy said, Fairbanks, Alaska.
I've been there, Mr. Castavet said. I've been all over Alaska. Fairbanks, Juneau, Anchorage, Nome, Seawood. I spent 4 months there in 1938, and I've made a lot of one-day stopovers in Fairbanks and Anchorage on my way to places in the Far East. I've been in small towns in Alaska, too, Dillingham and Akadarak.
Where are you folks from? Mrs. Castavet asked, fixing the folds at the bosom of her dress. I'm from Omaha, Rosemary said, and Guy is from Baltimore.
Omaha is a good city, Mr. Castavet said. Baltimore is, too.
Did you travel for business reasons? Rosemary asked him.
Business and pleasure both, he said. I'm 79 years old, and I've been going one place or another since I was 10. You name it, I've been there.
What business were you in? Guy asked.
Just about every business, Mr. Castavet said. Wool, sugar, toys, machine parts, marine insurance, oil.
A bell pinged in the kitchen.
Shake's ready, Mrs. Castavet said, standing up with her glass in her hand. Don't rush your drinks now. Take them along to the table. Roman, take your pill.
It will end on October 3rd, Mr. Castavet said. The day before the Pope gets here. No Pope ever visits a city where the newspapers are on strike.
Well, I heard on TV that he's going to postpone and wait till it's over,
Mrs. Castavet said. Guy smiled. Well, he said, that's showbiz. Mr. and Mrs. Castavet laughed, and Guy along with them. Rosemary smiled and cut her steak. It was overdone and juiceless, flanked by peas and mashed potatoes under flour-laden gravy. Still laughing, Mr. Castavet said,
It is, you know. That's just what it is. Showbiz.
You can say that again, Guy said.
The costumes, the rituals,
Mr. Castavet said.
Every religion, not only Catholicism. Pageants for the ignorant.
Mrs. Castavet said,
I think we're offending Rosemary.
No, not at all, Rosemary said.
You aren't religious, my dear, are you?
Mr. Castavet asked. I was brought up to be, Rosemary said, but now I'm an agnostic. I wasn't offended, really, I wasn't.
And you, Guy?
Mr. Castavet asked.
Are you an agnostic, too?
I guess so, Guy said. I don't see how anyone can be anything else. I mean, there's no absolute proof one way or the other, is there?
No, there isn't, Mr. Castavet said.
Mrs. Castavet, studying Rosemary, said,
You looked uncomfortable before when we were laughing at Guy's little joke about the Pope. Well, he is the Pope, Rosemary said. I guess I've been conditioned to have respect for him, and I still do, even if I don't think he's holy anymore.
If you don't think he's holy, Mr. Castavet said, you should have no respect for him at all, because he's going around deceiving people and pretending he is holy.
Good point, Guy said. When I think what they spend on robes and jewels, Mrs. Castavet said.
A good picture of the hypocrisy behind organized religion, Mr. Castavet said, was given in Luther. Did you ever get to play the leading part, Guy?
Me? No, Guy said.
Weren't you Albert Finney's understudy?
Mr. Castavet asked. No, Guy said. The fellow who played Vernein was. I just covered 2 of the smaller parts.
That's strange, Mr. Castavet said. I was quite certain that you were his understudy. I remember being struck by a gesture you made and checking in the program to see who you were, and I could swear you were listed as Finney's understudy.
What gesture do you mean? Guy asked.
I'm not sure now. A movement of your...
I used to do a thing with my arms when Luther had the fit, a sort of involuntary reaching.
Exactly,
Mr. Castavet said.
That's just what I meant. It had a wonderful authenticity to it, in contrast, may I say, to everything Mr. Finney was doing.
Oh, come on now, Guy said.
I thought his performance was considerably overrated, Mr. Castavet said. I'd be most curious to see what you would have done with the part.
Laughing, Guy said, That makes 2 of us, and cast a bright-eyed glance at Rosemary. She smiled back, pleased that Guy was pleased. There would be no reproofs from him now for an evening wasted talking with Ma and Pa Settle. No kettle.
My father was a theatrical producer, Mr. Castavet said, and my early years were spent in the company of such people as Mrs. Fisk and Forbes Roberts and Otis Skinner and Majesker. I tend, therefore, to look for something more than mere competence in actors. You have a most interesting inner quality, Guy. It appears in your television work, too, and it should carry you very far indeed, provided, of course, that you get those initial breaks upon which even the greatest actors are to some degree dependent. Are you preparing for a show now?
I'm up for a couple of parts, Guy said.
I can't believe that you won't get them,
Mr. Castavet said. I can, Guy said. Mr. Castavet stared at him.
Are you serious?
He asked. Dessert was a homemade Boston cream pie that, though better than the steak and vegetables, had for Rosemary a peculiar and unpleasant sweetness. Guy, however, praised it heartily and ate a second helping. Perhaps he was only acting, Rosemary thought, repaying compliments with compliments. After dinner, Rosemary offered to help with the cleaning up. Mrs. Castavet accepted the offer instantly, and the 2 women cleared the table, while Guy and Mr. Castavet went into the living room. The kitchen, opening off the foyer, was small, and made smaller still by the miniature greenhouse Terry had mentioned. Some 3 feet long, it stood on a large white table near the room's one window. Goose-necked lamps leaned close around it, their bright bulbs reflecting in the glass and making it blinding white rather than transparent. In the remaining space, the sink, stove and refrigerator stood close together, with cabinets jutting out above them on all sides. Rosemary wiped dishes at Mrs. Castavet's elbow, working diligently and conscientiously in the pleasing knowledge that her own kitchen was larger and more graciously equipped. "Terry told me about that greenhouse," she said. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Castavet said. "It's a nice hobby. You ought to do it, too." "I'd like to have a spice garden someday," Rosemary said. "Out of the city, of course. If Guy ever gets a movie offer, we're going to grab it and go live in Los Angeles. I'm a country girl at heart." "You come from a big family?" Mrs. Castavet asked. "Yes," Rosemary said. "I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters. I'm the baby." "Are your sisters married?" "Yes, they are." Mrs. Castavet pushed the soapy sponge up and down inside a glass. Do they have children? She asked. One has 2, and the other has 4, Rosemary said. At least that was the count the last I heard. It could be 3 and 5 by now. Well, it's a good sign for you, Mrs. Castavet said, still soaping the glass. She was a slow and thorough washer. If your sisters have lots of children, chances are you will too. Things like that go in families. Oh, we're fertile, all right, Rosemary said, waiting towel in hand for the glass. My brother Eddie has 8 already, and he's only 26. My goodness, Mrs. Castavet said. She rinsed the glass and gave it to Rosemary. All told, I've got 20 nieces and nephews, Rosemary said. I haven't even seen half of them. Don't you go home every once in a while? Mrs. Castavet asked. No, I don't, Rosemary said. I'm not on the best of terms with my family, except one brother. They feel I'm the black sheep. Oh? How is that? Because Guy isn't Catholic, and we didn't have a church wedding. Mrs. Castavet said, Isn't it something the way people fuss about religion? Well, it's their loss, not yours. Don't you let it bother you any. That's more easily said than done, Rosemary said, putting the glass on a shelf. Would you like me to wash and you wipe for a while? No, this is fine, dear, Mrs. Castavet said. Rosemary looked outside the door. She could see only the end of the living room. There was bridge tables and file cabinets. Guy and Mr. Castavet were at the other end. A plane of blue cigarette smoke lay motionless in the air. Rosemary? She turned. Mrs. Castavet, smiling, held out a wet plate in a green rubber-gloved hand. It took almost an hour to do the dishes and pans and silver, although Rosemary felt she could have done them alone in less than half that time. When she and Mrs. Castavet came out of the kitchen and into the living room, Guy and Mr. Castavet were sitting facing each other on the settee, Mr. Castavet driving home point after point, with repeated strikings of his forefinger against his palm. Now, Roman, you stop bending Guy's ear with your Majeska stories, Mrs. Castavet said. He's only listening 'cause he's polite. No, it's interesting, Mrs. Castavet, Guy said. You see, Mr. Castavet said. Minnie, Mrs. Castavet told Guy. I'm Minnie and he's Roman, okay? She looked mock defiantly at Rosemary. Okay? Guy laughed. Okay, Minnie, he said. They talked about the Goulds and the Bruns and Dibin and Devore, about Terry's sailor brother who had turned out to be in a civilian hospital in Saigon, and, because Mr. Castavet was reading a book critical of the Warren Report, about the Kennedy assassination. Rosemary, in one of the straight-back chairs, felt oddly out of things, as if the Castavets were old friends of Guy's, to whom she had just been introduced. Do you think it could have been a plot of some kind? Mr. Castavet asked her, and she answered awkwardly, aware that a considerate host was drawing a left-out guest into conversation. She excused herself and followed Mrs. Castavet's directions to the bathroom, where there were flowered paper towels inscribed, For our guest, and a book called Jokes for the John that wasn't especially funny. They left at 10:30, saying, Goodbye, Roman, and Thank you, Minnie, and shaking hands with an enthusiasm and an implied promise of more such evenings together that, on Rosemary's part, was completely false. Rounding the first bend in the hallway and hearing the door close behind them, she blew out a relieved sigh and grinned happily at Guy when she saw him doing exactly the same. Now, Roman, he said, working his eyebrows comically, you stop bending Guy's ears with them here Majeska stories. Laughing, Rosemary cringed and hushed him, and they ran hand in hand on ultra-quiet tiptoes to their own door, which they unlocked, opened, slammed, locked, bolted, chained, and Guy nailed it over with imaginary beams, pushed up 3 imaginary boulders, hoisted an imaginary drawbridge, and mopped his brow and panted, while Rosemary bent over double and laughed into both hands. About that steak, Guy said. Oh, my God, Rosemary said. The pie. How did you eat 2 pieces of it? It was weird. Dear girl, Guy said, that was an act of superhuman courage and self-sacrifice. I said to myself, ye gods, I'll bet nobody's ever asked this old bat for seconds on anything in her entire life. So I did it. He waved a hand grandly. Now and again I get these noble urges. They went into the bedroom. She raises herbs and spices, Rosemary said, and when they're full grown, she throws them out the window. Shh, the walls have ears, Guy said. Hey, how about that silverware? Isn't that funny? Rosemary said, working her feet against the floor to unshoe them. Only 3 dinner plates that match, and they've got that beautiful, beautiful silver.
Let's be nice. Maybe they'll will it to us.
Let's be nasty and buy our own. Did you go to the bathroom?
There? No.
Guess what they've got in it?
A bidet?
No. Jokes for the John.
No.
Rosemary shucked off her dress. A book on a hook, she said, right next to the toilet. Guy smiled and shook his head. He began taking out his cufflinks, standing beside the armoire.
Those stories of Romans, though, he said, were pretty damn interesting, actually. I've never even heard of Forbes Robertson before, but he was a very big star in his day.
He worked at the second link, having trouble with it.
I'm going to go over there tomorrow night and hear some more, he said.
Rosemary looked at him, disconcerted. You are? She asked.
Yes, he said. He asked me.
He held out his hand to her.
Can you get this off of me?
She went to him and worked at the link, feeling suddenly lost and uncertain. I thought we were going to do something with Jimmy and Tiger, she said.
Was that definite?
He asked. His eyes looked into hers.
I thought we were just going to call and see.
It wasn't definite, she said. He shrugged.
We'll see them Wednesday or Thursday.
She got the link out and held it on her palm. He took it.
Thanks, he said. You don't have to come along if you don't want to. You can stay here.
I think I will, she said. Stay here. She went to the bed and sat down.
He knew Henry Irving, too, Guy said. It's really terrifically interesting.
Rosemary unhooked her stockings. Why did they take down the pictures? She said.
What do you mean?
They're pictures. They took them down, in the living room and in the hallway leading back to the bathroom. There are hooks in the wall and clean places, and the one picture that is there over the mantel doesn't fit. There are 2 inches of clean at both sides of it. Guy looked at her.
I didn't notice, he said.
And why do they have all those files and things in the living room? She asked.
That, he told me, Guy said, taking off his shirt. He puts out a newsletter for stamp collectors all over the world. That's why they get so much foreign mail.
Yes, but why in the living room? Rosemary said. They have 3 or 4 other rooms, all with the doors closed. Why doesn't he use one of those? Guy went to her, shirt in hand, and pressed her nose with a firm fingertip.
You're getting nosier than Minnie, he said,
kissed air at her, and went out to the bathroom. 10 or 15 minutes later, while in the kitchen putting on water for coffee, Rosemary got the sharp pain in her middle that was the night before signal of her period. She relaxed with one hand against the corner of the stove, letting the pain have its brief way, and then she got out a Chemex paper and the can of coffee, feeling disappointed and forlorn. She was 24, and they wanted 3 children 2 years apart, but Guy wasn't ready yet, nor would he ever be ready, she feared, until he was as big as Marlon Brando and Richard Burton put together. Didn't he know how handsome and talented he was, how sure to succeed? So her plan was to get pregnant by accident. The pills gave her headaches, she said, and rubber gadgets were repulsive. Guy said that subconsciously she was still a good Catholic, and she protested enough to support the explanation. Indulgently, he studied the calendar and avoided the dangerous days, and she said, No, it's safe today, darling, I'm sure it is. And again this month he had won, and she had lost in this undignified contest in which he didn't even know they were engaged. Damn, she said, and banged the coffee can down on the stove. Guy in the den called.
What happened?
I bumped my elbow, she called back. At least she knew now why she had become depressed during the evening. Double damn. If they were living together and not married, she would have been pregnant 50 times by now.